Hey guys, Stephen here. I'm coming to you from my office here in Abbotsford. It's actually Sunday afternoon. I had a scheduling conflict that doesn't allow me to be at class, but I wouldn't let that keep me from giving you this riveting information on John Knox and the legacy that he leaves us. The 7 different areas I'm going to cover are his education, conversion, and early years. The second one is his exile time and his time of traveling ministry. Third are his writings and his tracts, quite interesting. The fourth is his return back to Scotland. And fifth, the books of policy and faith that he wrote for the church in Edinburgh. As well as 6, Mary's arrival and Knox's loss. And 7th, finally, Mary's suspicious actions and what happened to her and how John both profited from that and what he may have had to do with that. And then finally, I'll wrap it up with then the list of the reasons why are the legacy that he's left for us and why that's important. So we don't have a ton of time, so let's jump right into this. So the first section I'm going to go into, obviously you kind of see as I put it up here, is his education, early years, and conversion. So John Knox, there's not a whole lot known about his early history, but born to a small town guy, and he did go and study. His dad, I guess, wanted him to be in the papacy. So he grew up Catholic. He grew up in the Catholic area. He went to university, although from the best I could tell through research, he did not graduate, but he returned back to the Catholic Church and served for them. Now, in the time frame that he lived, there was quite a bit of stirring going on with the Protestant Reformation. People were not happy with the Catholic Church. Very similar to where in Germany and the Holy Roman Empire and all that kind of stuff. However, again, in Scotland, the Catholics had power. And with that power, they really made it very toxic for Protestants to live and especially to preach and teach their message. However, there was still quite a bit of material and stuff getting smuggled into the country. This is kind of where John Knox got his start into it. John Knox was a good friend of George Wishart and kind of followed along with him. But then something happened in 1546 where George Wishart was actually tortured and burned at the stake. In reprisal to that, there was a group of 16 Protestants that actually went and took over a castle where the cardinal at the time, David Beaton, who was the one that authorized the murder, I guess you could say. 16 Protestants came and they overtook him and killed him, actually in a quite equally as brutal way. Now, John Knox was not part of that, but when he heard about that, he didn't oppose it. In fact, immediately after they killed him, the French, at the time, because there was a heavy French influence into Scotland, they came and they attacked the castle and besieged it. However, the Protestants held their own, and there was a brief pause there for a bit where neither sides were attacking. And in that pause, John Knox actually slipped in. He came in and started to support them in that castle. Interestingly enough, while in that castle, he was attending a Protestant service, and John Ruff was delivering a message, and in the midst of the public opinion or public service, John Ruff challenged or brought out in public and saying John Knox has a ministry of preaching and teaching. Initially, John Knox said, no, I can't do that. But feeling that it was a divine calling, eventually gave in and took on that role of preaching and teaching. Unfortunately, that castle, the besieged castle, was overtaken by the French in 1547, which brings me into my second point, the exile and traveling ministry of John Knox. So in 1547, John Knox was captured and sent to exile and actually worked in the galleys of the French ships as a slave for 19 months. When he was finally released back to Scotland, he actually fled. Because again, at that time, it was very dangerous to be a Protestant, and especially dangerous to be teaching and preaching. And if there's one thing we can say of John Knox, is he's very persistent. Once he gets an idea in his mind, he doesn't let it go. And we'll see that a little bit later in some of his work. So he went to exile. He went out to Geneva, where he actually met John Calvin. And John Calvin really took to him and actually considered him a brother. And he learned a lot, and a lot of John Knox's theology you'll actually see is very similar to Calvinism. And that's what really gave him the foundation of a lot of the changes that you'll see he made. So from that, He met John Calvin. He actually did quite a few trips back to Scotland, where he was actually a wanted criminal at the time, but managed to escape capture and do a bunch of preaching against the monarchy. He would call them spiritual, the Catholic priests and stuff. He'd call them spiritual fornicators, bloody wolves, harlots that polluted this with spiritual fornication. And in that time is the times where he wrote his best work, or best known works, like the history of Reformation of religion within the realm of Scotland. Which is not really history so much, it's more polemic than it is history. But he also wrote several things against Queen Mary at the time, and he actually wrote one specifically called The First Trumpet Against a Monstrous Regime of Women, specifically targeted at Mary at the time. And another one called The Appellations to the Nobility and the Commonalty of Scotland, which he would appeal to even the commons to reject the regime of the Catholic Church, reject the monarchy, which again was very tied to the Catholic Church, and to go for Protestant change and Reformation. That brings me to the fourth topic here, and that's when Knox was actually invited to return. He returned and began preaching, and he was made the minister of the Edinburgh Church. During that time, the small military that the Edinburgh Church controlled began to push back with the French, and the French began to leave, and actually they succeeded in taking the French out of the country. With some help from England, they pushed them back out and regained control of their country. And during that time, that actually leads me again to my fifth point. John Knox was asked to write books on policy and faith. His books were very distinctively Calvinistic, and they were obviously very distinctly Protestant. But the important thing to realize is that these books, when they were presented to the ruling governors at the time, weren't initially accepted. In fact, at that time, Queen Mary was given, Queen Mary I from France, a Catholic queen, was given the right to come. I'm not exactly, I think it was through like a marriage or arrangement or something like that, where she was given Scotland, essentially, the rule of Scotland. And when she arrived, there was a huge loss for her. And this is kind of getting into my sixth section here, which is Mary's arrival and John Knox's loss. Upon the arrival of Mary, a lot of people were very fearful of what might happen, fearful of the arrival again of the killings and the martyrdoms and stuff like that. And so a lot of his supporters jumped ship. Their little military that they had going on that had driven the French out had jumped ship to go back and either support nobody or support Mary in her efforts to try and kind of bring back. However, at the time, with the Church of Edinburgh that had set up, it was actually illegal to have Catholic masses. So Mary, even the Catholic masses she had, they often had to be done under secrecy, and if they were known about, under sword and protection to keep them safe, right? And so, however, there was an interesting turn of events. Mary's husband had died very mysteriously, and actually, I believe most of the Scots either believe, I'm not sure if it was proven or not, but believe that she was murdered, or that he was murdered, and that she was the culprit and the cause of that. And it was also very suspicious, because as soon as he died, a very short period of time later, she actually got married to another guy. Because of that, she was put on trial, and she was actually ordered till execution. And James V succeeded. And apparently he was a Protestant. It was a good move, and John Knox was actually a really strong pusher towards that conviction of Mary and to get her out. And when that happened, immediately the books that John Knox had written on policy and faith had been brought back again to the church and then had been ratified and accepted, which really began to set the stage for democracy within the church and democracy within Scotland itself. Although looking back on it now, you would think it's a very heavy democracy, very authoritarian, but a democracy nonetheless, and one that really supported and brought on a lot of that change. With that being said, John Knox was a good guy. He went through a lot of these very challenging situations in his life, and he left, in my opinion, a great legacy for us to look over. Although I wouldn't personally agree with how he did everything, it's really hard for me to judge because we're not there in that time and that place. We don't have a real full understanding of what it was like to be a reformer and to be always under the sword and fearful of death type of thing. So with that being said, the legacies that he left behind is, first of all, one of Reformation. When he got the vision for Reformation, he followed it through to the bitter end. The second is one for intense moral strength. The guy, even after slavery, after fear of death, after being chased down by many people, never stopped pursuing the call that God had put on his life. Never stopped preaching, never stopped growing, even down to his death. Also, surprisingly, the growth of democracy within the church, which then, of course, spread out into the country itself and heavily influenced both Scotland and England in the path towards a democratic government. And the fourth is, of course, independence for Scotland. Having had that small military, religious military, pushing out the French and, again, kind of bringing about that democracy, independence was a big thing for John. He left when he died in independent Scotland. And, of course, that then would help set the stage for much more independence later on. And finally, of course, the most famous thing is the Scottish